I'd like to talk a little bit about hypnotic storytelling. So I think the best way, perhaps not, but maybe the best way is to begin with a story and then to analyze the individual features of that story afterwards, thereby cementing some of the tips, tricks, techniques, tactics that go into the creation of an effective hypnotic story. So, following is a true story, one derived from my own autobiography. And I actually had the incredible fortune in my high school years to meet a friend who I bonded with at first over his gangly features, his inclination towards, let's say, intellectual activities, and of course our mutual propensity towards video games. So I would invite him over, and I would simply watch him play Mega Man for hours, shouting at the proper directions. You should go up and left and down, you got to charge there, etc. And I would find myself, discussing some of the other topics too. Neither one of us were overly popular. Neither one of us had an incredible amount of experience with women, let's say, and we had speculated on all these things and how to best accomplish our goals. And, at the time as well, I had some philosophical inclinations, so I'd ask him what exactly the meaning of life was, what it was all for, beyond Mega Man, of course. And he said, I'm not so sure myself, but I think that we might find it out together. And I imagined, okay, well, in time, of course, we're going to grow up and we're going to figure out our own independent paths and sort out exactly all these questions for ourselves. And one day he said to me, I can't really come over today. Things have been pretty hectic with my family. And I said, what does that mean? I had a little bit of concern. He said, well, my dad's job is real unsteady. I thought, well, my dad goes to work at 9, gets back at 5, does this and that, but doesn't seem particularly unsteady. I couldn't imagine what his dad was doing. So I eventually went over to his house and I met his father, who was a shipwreck hunter, an underwater shipwreck explorer who hauled up literal tons of gold and silver. And correspondingly, had a fairly irregular haul of treasure from which he eked his existence. So I was astounded. I almost couldn't believe it, right? And I couldn't really understand what went into a decision like that. How does one even come up with the idea to be a shipwreck hunter, much less to actually do it? And eventually I sat down with him and I talked with him. I said, well, how did you end up in this line of business, so to speak? And he said, Jeremy, it wasn't so long ago. I wondered the same thing myself. I said, what? Hey, what are you getting on about? He said, well, I was in college and I had begun to have this propensity towards sailing. Of course, I'd sailed my whole life, but I really wondered what I was going to do. And in fact, I actually dropped out of college sometime later, and I bought my first ROV, or underwater robot, and I began exploring these shipwrecks. I began uncovering some of this gold and silver and whatnot. And I had my first big find in the Caribbean. And I had all these people talking to me, asking me, why are you doing this? How are you doing this? And I thought back to my friend in college, my old roommate. And he said to me, come on, man, you got to try it. And I said, what are you talking about? He says, come on, you've got to try it. And I said, well, I'm not so sure about that. Not so sure that I have to try. He says, how are you going to go through your life without knowing what you're living it for? And I raised my eyebrows and I couldn't quite understand what he was getting at. He says, everything's got its purpose and you're just waiting to find it. And I wondered to myself, this guy's high, he's got all kinds of messed up 6 ways since Tuesday. There's no way in the world I'm putting my brain in that position. And I imagined, what in the world he could be talking about. But I wondered too, what is my life's purpose? What exactly is my meaning? And so eventually, at great length, I began to remember a few things. I began to think back on my childhood. And I had forgotten it so long ago. I'd forgotten so much, but I was sailing on a boat with my granddad. And I went out. It was a sunny day, but our boat was small. And a frigate came by, a big freighter, and the freighter didn't see us, and we couldn't get the boat out of the way in time, and in the wake it crushed our boat. Only the mast was still floating. And so my granddad tied his belt to the mast, and he tied me to the mast with it, and I just held him as he got colder, sharks came. I don't remember much beyond that, but then hours later, I waved ship down. And they said, it must be real special to have survived that. And I thought back in my days in college, and I said, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. That's why I'm alive, is to drag up that past, to bring up what is lost from the bottom of the ocean and bring it back into the future. And as he finished telling me this story, I was flabbergasted. I thought it was unreal. Of course, he flips through the first pages of his biography. And his biography, of course, included that, as well as many more revealing details. I was just beside myself. I couldn't imagine having such a clear purpose. And I asked, was that good? I mean, do you feel like a victim? Or he said, no, I'm a hero. I feel like I've got a real purpose, something solid to base my life around. And I wondered with my friend, I said, we don't have anything quite like that. We don't have anything that profound, anything that magnetic to base our entire careers upon. And he said, well, we'll just have to discover it. I thought to myself that was a pretty decent answer at the time, and I hope and I imagine that I've discovered a few since then. One of these, of course, is sharing these kinds of stories with you today. Okay, so wrapping it up, we have a triple nested story. It's not too heavy on the pacing and leading, even though during the deeper components, the more subconscious bits of the story, we do slow down. We do get a little bit more dramatic, and frankly, it's as appropriate, right? I mean, naturally, because I'm fortunate enough to have a story that has such a kind of a gnarly bit in there in the middle, it is only appropriate to pay homage and to take it slowly and seriously and to dramatize it as is appropriate. That's typical matching my tone, the tonality, and the presentation with the content of the story. So we slow down a bit. There's not too much pacing. There are a few select phrases, but it's more like a narrative, a thematic arc that, one, questions the meaning of life, the purpose of life. Two, finds that purpose through a secondary means, the life of my friend's father, right? And then third, concludes all three narrative arcs simultaneously, or roughly simultaneously, with an outgoing message of finding one's own purpose. And then wrapping up all nicely with a bow by saying that part of my purpose is to talk with you now. So the nesting has an important function. The nesting, if you are not following my meaning at the moment, nesting is essentially telling a story within a story within a story. In this case, there are three. So the transition is smooth, and it begins first with the story of my high school years with a friend. And then my friend and transitions into sitting down with his father, who tells me a rather extraordinary tale. The tale beginning with college, and beginning with this overarching motif of meaning, what is purpose and understanding. And then it goes deeper into childhood memories, my friend's father's childhood memories, the tertiary layer, which is the deepest and most subconscious. Rising back to the college years, we have a switch of narrators that's not entirely clear, which actually allows me to speak more from the first person, which is a powerful way to associate with the listener. And thirdly, we have the switch back to me listening to the story from my friend's father. And finally, if we consider this quaternary, me speaking with my friend about the story that his father told me. So these various shifts are important to, one, actually disguise some of the interior contents of the story. The deepest content of the story, the part where my friend's father is on the sailboat as a child with his grandfather, is actually pretty well buried. I mean, it's unlikely to be forgotten because it is the height of the drama of the story, the height of the narrative arc, and it represents the height of the conflict as well, because the real conflict here is finding meaning from one's life experiences, finding meaning from, in this case, trauma, as well as finding meaning from the absence of trauma. In any case, we're still searching for that meaning, and it's an active process, but one that has to be determined and empowered to be transformative. So this nature of the transformation is, in fact, one of the key psychological elements of hypnotic storytelling. So one, the characters have to be relatable. One has to find themselves imagining the character. And the fact that in any story, we imagine the character and the narrative arc, we imagine all these things in our own mind, and we project ourselves into the plot lines of the story is a strong indicator, is a necessary component of the story, the suspension of disbelief that allows us to psychologically embody the characters of the story. Now, if it's to be an effective hypnotic story, we have to have some persuasive goal in mind, right? So simply telling an engaging story, which is in fact a prerequisite, but simply telling an engaging story is inadequate to transform the individual in such a way that the listener of the story is going to have some revelatory experience or even a more subtle psychological change. To guarantee that, we need to have the message clearly delineated. Now, the message can be rather buried. In fact, there's some advantage, especially to, let's say, hard to accept messages, of burying it deep inside of several nested stories and implying it repeatedly in diverse ways. In this case, because the message is fairly easy to understand, the message is about finding purpose and transforming one's past into assets or tools for the present. We can actually very comfortably announce this message, and through repetition at every layer of the story, particularly the transformative, in-depth story at the very bottom, we can really begin to understand exactly the utility of, let's say, deriving her purpose and meaning from trauma, difficulty, and even the more mundane aspects of life. So, finally, reflecting on this story, if we need to adapt the story, now let's say you're somebody who desires a particular thing, or whom I desire a particular outcome or goal for, right? I mean, finding peace and serenity in one's meaning of life is fairly generic, and the same stories can be adapted to tell different messages. Now, in this case, let's say the veracity gets somewhat distorted if I am to adapt one of the underlying messages of the story, because in fact, very much is about meaning in life, and from the experiences, the derivation of that meaning from the experiences that we all hold unique about ourselves. But should it be useful or necessary, it's possible to adapt the story to convey a different thematic motif. And in that manner, we can really begin to explore not simply the art of storytelling or creating an alluring story, but creating powerful hypnotic content embedded within it. In fact, the story itself is fairly simple. It lacks a lot of the hypnotic themes and motifs that could be present to heighten the state of trance. Right, so next time, hopefully I'll share with you a little more in-depth hypnotic story. That being said, it will be a lot slower and feature a lot more trance-related language. I look forward to that. I hope we do too. So long.